A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Fire and Ghosts. The pounding beneath her ribs never ceased. Evra had learned long ago to recognize her heartbeat as the metronome of survival. At 4 years old, that frantic rhythm was all she could hear above the screams that pierced the wooden walls of her home, above the crackle of flames consuming everything her mother had held dear. Beneath the loose floorboard of the cottage, the girl curled into herself, her small frame compressed into the narrow space where her mother had hidden her moments before. The darkness was absolute, suffocating in its completeness. Through the warped gaps in the timber, she watched boots. Red-cloaked figures moved through her home with purpose, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Leather creaked, steel clinked. The unmistakable sound of a sword being drawn made her throat constrict so violently she feared the sound of her breathing would betray her position. "Stay silent." Her mother's voice had been barely more than a whisper. "Do not move. Do not cry. Do not speak until the sun returns twice. Understand, little one?" The child had nodded, though her mother couldn't see her in the darkness. Understanding was secondary to obedience in moments like this. The girl's small fingers pressed against her lips, a self-imposed lock to keep sounds from escaping. A scream erupted from somewhere deeper in the cottage. Not her mother's voice, but someone else's. A man, the rogue who had been guarding their home. Evra's bottom lip trembled as the sounds grew worse, then suddenly ceased, replaced by the sound of her mother calling out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Take what you want, please. She's just a child." But there was no mercy in the responses. Only orders barked in voices she didn't recognize, accents that didn't belong to anyone from Thornhold. The girl covered her ears, pressing her palms so hard against her skull that lights exploded behind her eyelids. This was worse than the fear. This was helplessness. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes that felt like eternities. The cottage grew hotter, and the acrid smell of smoke began seeping through the floorboard gaps. Evra's eyes watered. Soot dusted her blonde hair, turning it gray. The flames were coming closer, consuming the spaces above her head. Heat radiated through the wood, and she realized with the clarity only panic can bring that she was going to burn alive in this box. She reached upward, trying to push the floorboard away, but her small hands lacked the strength. Tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. She opened her mouth to scream, but a sound from above stopped her. A different sound, not the heavy boots of the red-cloaked soldiers. Something else. Something that moved with predatory grace. A crash. The splintering of wood as something large forced its way through her family's burning home. Claws raked across the floorboard above her, and the girl gasped. Her scream caught in her throat. "Here," a voice called out. Rough. Urgent. "I found her." The floorboard above wrenched open, and suddenly there was light. Too much light, blinding and full of dancing orange flames. A man with gray-streaked hair and scarred features reached down, his wolf eyes glowing amber in the firelight. He was one of them, one of the shifters. Evra's terror crystallized into something primal. "Easy, little one," he said, his tone deliberately soft despite the chaos surrounding them. "I'm not going to hurt you. Your mother sent me." Evra wasn't sure if she imagined it, or truly heard her mother's voice calling her name from somewhere beyond the flames. She reached upward without consciously deciding to, her small fingers grasping the man's wrist as he lifted her from the coffin she'd been trapped in. Her lungs seized when the smoke hit them, and the man, Rowan, though she wouldn't learn his name until later, pulled her against his chest, his own transformation beginning as he bolted from the burning cottage. The world became a blur of heat and speed and terror. His wolf form was massive, larger than any she'd ever heard stories about. His thick fur was the color of storm clouds, and his muscles coiled with supernatural power as he crashed through the forest, away from Thornhold and the red-cloaked soldiers. Behind them, the village burned. The screams of her neighbors faded into the darkness. She remembered her mother's warmth only for a moment before it was gone. Completely. Irrevocably. The transition from cottage floor to wide world was too sudden, too violent. One moment she had been hidden. The next, she was running through a forest she didn't recognize, carried by a stranger who smelled of pine and earth, and something wild she had no name for. The memories became fragmented after that. Flames. Smoke. A man's voice. Rowan's voice. Telling her that everything would be all right. That he would take care of her. That the Alpha King had done this terrible thing to her village, to her family, and that one day when she was strong enough, she would help avenge them all. 15 years of believing that lie shaped everything she became. At 19, Evra moved through the rogue camp with the fluidity of someone who had been trained since childhood in combat. Her body bore the marks of that education. Calluses on her palms from handling swords, scars along her ribs and shoulders from sparring, and the lean musculature of someone who lived for battle. Her hair, once the honey blonde of her childhood, had darkened to a rich auburn brown and hung in thick waves past her shoulders. Her eyes remained the same piercing blue-gray, but where they had once held innocence, now they held only determination. The camp itself existed in a perpetual state of controlled chaos. Rogues, shifters who refused to bow to pack hierarchies, and the rule of the Alpha King, moved between canvas tents and crude shelters built from branches and hides. The northern forest provided cover, thick enough that aerial scouts rarely ventured here. The scent markers that Rowan's pack maintained ensured that those seeking sanctuary knew where to find them. Evra had never questioned her place among them. Rowan was her father in every way that mattered. He had saved her life, raised her, educated her in the ways of combat and strategy. He had given her purpose when she had none, and that purpose was singular and immovable. She would kill the man responsible for destroying everything she had been born to. Again, Rowan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a pack leader who had built something from nothing. He circled her in the training ground, a cleared space between the trees where earth had been packed hard from years of sparring sessions. His own transformation was held in check through sheer will, a gift of age and discipline that the younger rogues had not yet mastered. Evra attacked without hesitation. Her movements were economical, each strike calculated for maximum efficiency. She had developed her own style over the years, one that compensated for her body's refusal to shift. Where other rogues relied on the strength of their wolf forms, she relied on speed and precision. Her sword work was exceptional for her age, and her unarmed combat was devastating in its effectiveness. Rowan deflected her attack, testing her technique. Finding weakness. Your stance is too wide. You're leaving yourself vulnerable on your left side. She corrected immediately, moving into a tighter position, but already she could feel the frustration mounting in her chest. This was the moment that happened every training session, the moment that happened every day of her life, since her body had declared its refusal to obey her will. Try to shift, Rowan instructed, just as he had 10,000 times before. Evra closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for the presence she could feel, but never quite grasp. Other shifters described it as a second skin, something that sat right beneath their human form and could be accessed with a thought. For her, it was like reaching for something submerged in deep water. She could see its outline, could sense its existence. But the moment her mental fingers brushed against it, it slipped away into depths she couldn't follow. Her body remained stubbornly human. No fur sprouted. No bones reshaped themselves. No claws extended from her fingertips. Nothing. There's a block, Rowan said, not unkindly. He had learned long ago that his frustration would only compound hers. Your mind is refusing the transformation. It's a protection mechanism. Your psyche is keeping you human because you're afraid. I'm not afraid, Evra snapped, opening her eyes. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, because they both knew it was partially true. She was terrified, not of the transformation itself, but of what it meant that she couldn't access it. Among shifters, the inability to change was weakness. It was vulnerability. It marked her as different, and different was something rogues could not afford to be. The trauma of that day, Rowan continued, moving away from her and toward the fire pit where evening meals were prepared. What you witnessed, what you experienced beneath that floorboard. Your mind built walls to protect you. Those walls are now the very thing keeping you from your true nature. Evra had heard this explanation countless times. It had become the narrative of her existence. She was broken, yes, but not irreparably. The Alpha King had broken her, or that's what she had been told. The Alpha King, the man who ruled the shifter hierarchy with an iron will, the man whose soldiers had torched her village and killed her family, the man whose existence was the only reason Evra had survived to adulthood, because hatred was a more powerful motivator than hope could ever be. The evening air held the chill of approaching autumn. The rogue camp prepared for the transition into colder months, when hunting would become more difficult and supplies would need to be rationed. Rowain had plans for the coming season, plans that had been growing in his mind for months. Evra had overheard fragments of conversations, seen him studying maps and taking inventory of their weapons. Something was building toward a crescendo. She sat by the fire as sunset painted the forest in shades of amber and crimson. Around her, rogues transformed into their wolf forms, their bodies shifting with a fluidity that her own refused to replicate. She watched with the particular ache that only comes from exclusion born of biology. They were all the same species, all part of the same genetic inheritance. Yet her body had turned against her. A younger rogue named Soren approached, his newly formed wolf body still uncertain in its movements. He was maybe 17, freshly transitioned into what most shifters considered their true form. He offered her a strip of dried meat, the gesture more friendly than pitying. She took it with gratitude. "Your time will come," Soren said, his voice slightly distorted by his partially shifted state. "My sister didn't transform until she was 22. Rowain says it's all mental." Evra nodded, not bothering to correct him. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to paralysis. Better to exist in the space between expectation and acceptance, moving forward through sheer determination. The night deepened. Rowain emerged from his tent, his presence commanding immediate attention. Those gathered around the fire sensed the shift in his energy. This was not a casual evening. This was a gathering called with purpose. "Tomorrow, word arrives from contacts in the Southern Territories," Rowain announced, his eyes moving across each face illuminated by firelight. "The Alpha King travels toward the northeastern hunting grounds, a private expedition. Guards, yes, but nothing like the force that would accompany official state business." The rogues shifted, their attention sharpening. Hunting expeditions were rare opportunities. The Alpha King moved like a ghost through his territories, rarely seen, always protected. But hunting expeditions required a certain intimacy. Fewer guards, more vulnerability. Rowain's gaze finally settled on Evra. "There's something you must do," he said, his tone formal in a way that marked this as significant. "A trial. A test of your commitment. Are you ready?" Evra straightened. Every cell in her body resonated with recognition. This was the moment she had been waiting for her entire conscious life. "I am." "Then we prepare the oath binding," Rowain said. "Tomorrow at sunrise you will swear a blood vow that cannot be broken, that cannot be forgotten. You will bind yourself at the cellular level to the promise of vengeance. You will pledge your life to the death of the Alpha King and his bloodline." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward through her consciousness. This was commitment beyond words. Among shifters, blood oaths were sacred, irrevocable things. Breaking them resulted in physical agony that could not be medicated or survived. They were absolute. Evra looked around the fire at the faces watching her. These were the people who had raised her, who had loved her in their own way, who had given her identity and purpose. And tomorrow, she would bind herself to them completely. She would become not just a member of this pack, but a weapon wielded in service to their collective will. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across the forest clearing. In that moment, Evra didn't know that everything she believed about her past was constructed from carefully selected lies. She didn't know that the Alpha King she was about to swear to destroy had been a boy of 15 when her village burned. She didn't know that the man who had raised her, who had given her purpose and identity, had withheld crucial truths that would have changed everything. All she knew was the weight of her hatred and the clarity of her mission. Tomorrow, she would become bound to vengeance at the most fundamental level. Tomorrow, she would cease being merely Evra and become instead an instrument of retribution. The fire burned on into the night, consuming wood and releasing smoke that drifted through the trees like ghosts searching for something they could never quite grasp. Chapter 2. The Weight of Deception. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and earth, mixed with the particular musk that only predators released when their bodies shifted between forms. Evra had spent the better part of 3 days shadowing the Alpha King's hunting party, observing their movements with the precision she had been trained to employ since childhood. She moved through the forest with deliberate silence, her body attuned to every sound, every shift in the wind that might alert the guards surrounding their target. Kyle stood perhaps 200 paces away, stripped to the waist as he discussed strategy with his men. The northern territories were rich with game, and an official hunting expedition had been called to replenish stores before winter descended upon the kingdom. What made this particular journey valuable to Rowain's plan was the relative informality of it all. Fewer guards than would accompany a state function. More vulnerability. Opportunity. From her vantage point behind a moss-covered oak, Evra studied the man she had been taught to hate since she could form coherent thoughts. The Alpha King. The destroyer of Thornhold. The architect of her family's annihilation. He did not match the image she had constructed in her mind. This was the first problem. The inconsistency had been gnawing at her for days, creating a friction between expectation and observation that she could not quite resolve. Rowain had described him as a tyrant, a cruel and arbitrary ruler who wielded power without mercy. Yet what Evra saw was different. Kale moved among his men with an ease that suggested respect rather than fear. When one of the younger guards had twisted his ankle during the trek, the Alpha King had personally examined the injury, adjusting their route to accommodate the wounded man's limitations. He had shared his rations with those who were hungry. His commands were clear but not cruel. This did not fit. Evra pushed the contradiction aside. The mind played tricks when confronted with targets. Rowain had warned her about this. The human psyche sought reasons to sympathize, to soften the hard edges of necessary action. She was weak in that moment, allowing sentiment to blur the lines of her mission. She had blood-sworn an oath, bound herself at the cellular level to vengeance. Personal doubt was a luxury she could not afford. The Alpha King was 31 years old, though the details of his life had been less relevant to her than the singular fact of his guilt. She knew the broad strokes of his history, that he had assumed the throne at 15 following his father's death, that he had consolidated power quickly, that he maintained strict control over the various pack territories through an iron will, and the threat of his own considerable strength. What she did not know, what Rowain had never explained, was why a man of his obvious capability would sanction the destruction of a single village. It seemed almost beneath the scope of his attention. Again, she pushed the thought away. She did the math without wanting to. 16 years since Thornhold. Kale had taken the throne at 15. The authorization in the royal ledgers was dated a year before that, which meant he would have been 14 when her village burned, too young to sign a death warrant. The thought lodged under her ribs like a splinter. Poisoning was her method. In the evening, when the party made camp and began their routine of preparing meals and settling for the night, Evra would move into position. She had prepared the toxin herself, drawing on knowledge she had accumulated over years of training. It was slow-acting, designed to incapacitate rather than kill immediately. Once Kale fell ill, confusion would reign. In that moment of chaos, she would strike, a blade across the throat, a quick end to the man whose death had been the centerpiece of her existence for as long as she could remember. It was a sound plan. Simple. Direct. Executable. It was also doomed from the moment she attempted it. She had underestimated the Alpha King's senses. What she had attributed to the heightened awareness of any experienced warrior was actually something more fundamentally dangerous, the primal instinct of a shifter whose wolf form existed just beneath his human skin, straining against the boundaries of consciousness. Shifters of his age and power maintained only a gossamer thread of separation between human and beast, and that thread grew thinner when danger approached. When Evra moved toward his drink during the evening meal, when her fingers dipped into his cup with the vial of poison hidden between her palm and wrist, Kale's head snapped upward. His eyes locked onto hers across the firelit clearing. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, predator recognizing prey. though the distinction of which held which position was not immediately clear. Then everything descended into chaos. Cale moved with the fluid grace of someone whose body answered to instinct, without the necessity of conscious thought. He was already rising, already transitioning toward her, his expression shifting from relaxed to absolutely lethal in the space of a heartbeat. Evra's training took over. She ran. The forest became her ally, trees and underbrush providing obstacles that she navigated with the sureness of someone who had spent half her life running through wild places. Behind her, she could hear him crashing through the vegetation, but his passage was marked by size rather than elegance. He was large, muscular, powerful, but she was smaller, faster, more agile in the spaces between trees. For perhaps a mile, she believed she might actually escape. Then his hand closed around her ankle, and the world inverted. She went down hard, her momentum carrying her into a slide across forest floor that scraped skin raw and knocked the breath from her lungs. Before she could recover, before she could even attempt to scramble away, a body pressed her flat against the earth. Cale's weight was immense, controlled, absolute. His breathing was heavy, ragged with the effort of transformation held barely in check. She could smell it on him, the nearness of his wolf, the ferocity that lurked just beneath his skin, the barely contained violence. One of his guards had fallen during the chase. His shoulder bloodied where she had slashed him with her dagger as she ran past. It was the only advantage she had managed to secure. Everything else had gone wrong. Her speed advantage had meant nothing against his supernatural power. Her training was irrelevant against his raw dominance. Cale's hand circled her wrist, pinning her arm and the blade it still held. His eyes had taken on a golden luminescence, the color bleeding through his human irises as his beast pressed closer to the surface. There was rage there, the kind of fury that came from betrayal, from having death attempted in your own camp, from the violation of having your safety compromised. "Do not move," he commanded, and there was something inhuman in his voice, as though his wolf spoke alongside his human self. "Do not speak. Do not attempt anything else, or I will finish what nature began when you were born." The threat hung between them, tangible enough to taste. Evra's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might shatter bone. She had trained her entire life for combat, for violence, for the singular purpose of taking this man's life. She had never trained for what came after failure. Cale rose, hauling her upright with one hand wrapped around her throat. She dangled, feet barely brushing the forest floor, her body suspended by the sheer strength of his grip. There was no attempt at mercy, no restraint born of human sympathy. He looked at her the way one might examine an insect, assessing threat level and determining best method of disposal. Then he turned to his guards, those men who had followed him through the forest and now stood at the periphery of their impromptu battle. Weapons drawn, but held in check by a gesture from their alpha. "Take her away," Cale said, his voice returning to its human register, though the golden light remained in his eyes. "To the castle. We will determine what to do with her there." He released her throat, and she crashed to the ground gasping, her lungs burning as they tried to drag in oxygen through a bruised windpipe. Strong hands hauled her upright, and she was bound, wrists secured with leather straps that bit into her skin, a cloth forced between her teeth to prevent speech. As they marched her back toward the camp where the hunting party was organizing the transport of their captive, Evra caught a glimpse of Vorian's face. The beta's expression was complicated. There was satisfaction there, yes, but also something that looked almost like relief, as though a particular problem had been solved, and uncertainty had been removed from the board. He stepped close as the guards secured her to a horse. "Interesting," he murmured, though whether he was speaking to her or to himself was unclear. "Very interesting indeed that you came for him. I wonder who sent you." She tried to respond, but the gag prevented words. Vorian smiled, though the expression held no warmth. Then he turned away, returning to assist with the preparations for the journey to Cale's castle. She did not know, as she was transported through the forest toward a destination she could not predict, that Rowain was attempting to mount a rescue operation. She did not know that he was testing the castle's defenses with a small team, seeking weaknesses, planning extraction. She did not know that within hours, When that rescue attempt failed catastrophically against the efficiency of Cale's guard contingent, Rowan would make the decision that would alter the course of everything that came after. He would tell his pack that Evra had been killed in combat. He would mourn her with ceremony and ritual. And he would begin to calculate whether there were other pieces on the board that could be moved toward his objective. Evra, unconscious on the back of a horse moving toward a stone castle she had never imagined seeing, could not have known that the moment of her capture was simultaneously the moment of her liberation from a lie. She could not have known that everything she believed about her past was constructed from carefully cultivated deception, designed by a man who had his own reasons for maintaining her hatred. All she knew was darkness and pain, and the terrible certainty that she had failed at the only task that had ever truly mattered. Chapter 3. Fractures in the Foundation. The tower room was not a dungeon, though Evra had initially believed it to be one. High stone walls curved upward, punctuated by narrow windows that offered views of the castle grounds far below. A bed occupied one corner, its mattress filled with something that felt like feathers rather than straw. A table held a pitcher of water and a basin for washing. Guards changed shifts outside the heavy wooden door at regular intervals, but no one entered without Cale's direct command. She had attempted escape 3 times in the first 2 days. Each time the guards intercepted her before she reached the corridor. No violence occurred, only the quiet efficiency of men trained to contain threats without causing unnecessary harm. It was somehow worse than brutality. Violence offered opportunities for retaliation. This sterile competence offered nothing. Kyle himself came to question her on the evening of her second day in the tower. He entered alone, which struck her as foolish on his part. A single man, no matter how powerful, should not enter a confined space with someone who had already attempted his murder. Yet he showed no concern about the risk. "Your name," he said simply, settling into the single chair while she remained standing, bound at the wrists by cloth restraints. "Tell me your name." She said nothing. Silence was resistance in its simplest form. It denied him the courtesy of her compliance. "You attempted to poison my drink," he continued, as though she had answered. The toxin was expertly crafted, not something one learns without considerable training. Yet your physical combat skills, while competent, are inconsistent with someone who has been formally educated in warfare. This suggests your training has been unconventional. Still, she remained silent. He rose and approached her, his movements unhurried. This close, she could see the scars that decorated his body, marks of battles fought and survived. His eyes were the color of aged amber, clear and intelligent and utterly unforgiving. He tilted her chin upward with one finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I have spent 31 years learning to read people," he said quietly. "You carry hatred so deeply it has etched itself into your bones. But that hatred is directed at me specifically, not at the guards, not at the castle. You blame me personally for something. I intend to discover what." He released her and returned to the chair. "You will remain here until you decide that cooperation serves your interests better than defiance." "I am patient." He was, as it turned out, remarkably patient. For 4 days he came to question her, and for 4 days she maintained her silence. But silence became harder to sustain as exhaustion accumulated. On the 5th night, the nightmares began. She had experienced them before, brief flashes of memory that disturbed her sleep. But on this night, trapped in an unfamiliar room with nowhere to run from her own mind, the dreams took a different form. They became visceral, overwhelming. Flames surrounded her. The smell of burning wood and smoke filled her lungs until she couldn't breathe. She was small again, terrified, compressed into spaces that couldn't contain the magnitude of her fear. And through it all, a voice calling out in anguish. Her mother's voice, though the specific words were lost to the fog of trauma. She woke screaming. The sound tore from her throat before consciousness fully returned, before she could remember where she was or why. By the time her eyes opened, guards were already entering the room, and moments later, Cale appeared behind them. He dismissed the guards with a gesture and closed the door, leaving them alone in the darkness. "A nightmare," he said, moving closer. It was not a question. She turned away from him, her breathing still ragged, her heart still hammering against her ribs as though trying to escape her chest. She did not want him to see her like this. Broken, terrified, so obviously scarred by something that had nothing to do with his presence in her life. "Tell me what you remember," Kyle said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not kindness. She didn't believe him capable of that, but something that approximated understanding. "I remember flames," she heard herself say, as though her voice belonged to someone else. "I remember screaming. I remember red cloaks, imperial cloaks, soldiers with your insignia on their armor, marching through my home like—" She stopped herself, clamping her teeth shut against the words that wanted to spill out. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Tell me about this home. Where was it?" Against her better judgment, against every survival instinct that screamed at her to remain guarded, she found herself speaking. "A village. It was called Thornhold. It was in the Northern Territories. And your soldiers destroyed it. You destroyed it. They killed everyone. Not everyone." Kyle said quietly, "You survived." "Yes. How?" She couldn't answer that. Didn't want to examine too closely how she had come to be here, in a castle, in the hands of the man she had sworn to kill. The narrative of her life suddenly felt thin, inadequate, a story told so many times it had worn grooves into her understanding of truth. Kale moved to the window, gazing out at the darkness beyond the glass. "I was 19 years old 15 years ago," he said. "Thornhold was destroyed 16 years ago." Her mind caught on the discrepancy. 16, not 15. The timeline was wrong. She had been 4 when it happened, which meant she had been 4 a year before Kale even assumed the throne, which meant I would have been 14. Kale continued, barely able to hold a sword, barely beginning to understand what it meant to rule. My father was still alive. My father was still king. He turned to face her. "Do you truly believe I had the authority to order the destruction of a village when I was a child myself? Your soldiers wore your insignia," she said. But the conviction had leached from her voice. Something was fractioning inside her. A foundation that had supported her entire existence beginning to show cracks. "Many soldiers bear that insignia," Kale replied. "Some more loyal to the crown than to their conscience. Some given orders by men who should not have possessed that authority. Did anyone ever tell you specifically that I ordered your village destroyed? Or did you simply assume?" She opened her mouth to respond and found that she couldn't. Rowan had never explicitly stated it. He had implied. He had allowed her to construct the narrative herself, had offered just enough guidance that she had filled in the blanks to create a truth that satisfied her need for an answer. "I want to test something," Kyle said, and she looked at him warily. "With your permission." "A simple test." She nodded, uncertain and afraid. He guided her to the center of the room and instructed her to close her eyes. "Shifters can transform, change from human to wolf form, with relative ease. It is biological, hardwired into our nature. Can you do this?" She reached inward, searching for the presence that had always eluded her. It was there, as always, just beyond her grasp. She felt the resistance, the wall that her mind had constructed to keep it at bay. "I cannot," she said. "Why not?" "I don't know." Cal nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had been suspecting. "You were raised by shifters. Rowan, I suspect, given what you said about rogues. Rogues are shifters who refuse pack hierarchy. Is this correct?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Then your DNA is shifter," Kale said. "You possess the genetic material necessary for transformation. Your body should respond to your will as readily as any other shifter of your age and training. Yet it doesn't. Why would that be?" The question hung in the air between them, and suddenly she couldn't avoid the obvious answer. If she was raised by shifters, if her DNA was shifter, then something was fundamentally wrong, either with her origin story, or with her education, or with the person who had raised her. Or all of it. "I don't know," she whispered. "I think you do," Kale said gently. "I think on some level you've always known. And I think Rowan never wanted you to examine that knowledge too closely." She looked at him then, and for the first time, she truly saw him, not as the monster she had been trained to hate, but as a man with scars of his own, standing in a tower room with a broken girl who had tried to murder him, and she realized that she couldn't reconcile the two images. The tyrant who would order the destruction of a village for no reason, and the man who was attempting to help her untangle the lies of her own history. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Cale replied. "Whatever else has transpired between us, you deserve that." He left her alone after that, and Evra stood at the window, staring out at the darkness, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not acceptance yet. Not forgiveness, but the beginning of a question that had the potential to shatter everything she had believed about herself and her purpose. If the Alpha King hadn't destroyed Thornhold, then who had? And what did that mean for a woman whose entire identity had been constructed around avenging a betrayal that might never have occurred? Chapter 4. The Seeds of Doubt. Cale's private archives occupied the lowest level of the castle, a space carved from living stone and protected by enchantments that only those of royal blood could navigate without consequence. The walls were lined with ledgers and scrolls, records of every decision made by every Alpha King since the establishment of his lineage. Evra had been granted provisional freedom 3 days prior, released from her chains on the condition of a blood oath, a vow binding at the cellular level that she would not attempt escape or violence against Cale or his people. Among shifters, such oaths were sacred, unbreakable. Violating one would result in agony that would make death seem merciful. The transition from captivity to conditional freedom had been disorienting. She was no longer confined to the tower, but existed in a strange liminal space, permitted to wander the castle under discreet supervision. Guards followed at a distance, present but not oppressive. It was a kindness she didn't deserve and couldn't quite comprehend. Cale had brought her to the archives ostensibly to show her something. He moved through the organized chaos with the familiarity of someone who spent considerable time in these depths, his fingers trailing across leather-bound volumes as he searched for a specific record. Thornhold was documented as a provincial village, he explained, pulling a heavy ledger from a shelf and setting it on a wooden table. Population approximately 300, mostly human, with a handful of shifter families integrated into the community. It was never a significant center of trade or politics. There would be no strategic reason to target it specifically. He opened the ledger, revealing entries written in precise script. His fingers traced lines of text until he found what he was searching for. "This is the authorization for destruction," he said quietly. "Look at the date." Evra stepped closer, her breath catching as she read the date inscribed in the margin. 16 years ago, not 15. 1 year before Cale had assumed the throne. 1 year when he would have been approximately 14. A child by any standard, incapable of authorizing military action. "The signature," Cale continued, pointing to a scrawled name at the bottom of the authorization. "It appears to be mine, but I have no memory of writing it. I have no recollection of any discussion regarding Thornhold. And when I was 14 years old, I would not have possessed the authority to order anything of this magnitude." "Who had authority?" Evra asked, her mind struggling to reconcile this information with everything she had believed. "My father. And his closest advisors." Cale closed the ledger carefully. "When I assumed the throne at 15, I was young and grieving. My father's death had been unexpected. I relied heavily on those who claimed to have his ear, who claimed to understand his policies and intentions. Chief among them was Vorian. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a tension in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes that suggested pain held barely in check. "I attempted to investigate my father's death when I was 16, Cale said. "The official story was sudden illness, a failure of the heart, but there were inconsistencies. The manner of his death was unusual. I wanted answers. What happened?" "Vorian discouraged the investigation," Cale said flatly. "He told me that the kingdom couldn't afford to have its king focused on the past, that my father would have wanted me to move forward, that endless questions would only damage the stability I had worked to establish. I was young. I was grieving. I was persuaded." He turned away from the table, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I did not pursue it further. For 15 years I did not pursue it. I trusted the man who advised me, who guided me, who I believed had my best interests at heart." Evra felt something shift inside her chest. The walls she had built her entire life upon were crumbling, and in their place was only uncertainty and a terrible dawning comprehension. "You think Vorian had something to do with the destruction?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I think," Cale replied carefully, "that I need to understand exactly who authorized this action. And I think the answer may lead me to uncomfortable truths about the man I have trusted for 15 years. He retrieved another ledger, this one older, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. He turned to a specific page and held it before her. "This is the roster of military commanders who reported directly to my father. Vorian was not among them. He was a lieutenant then, subordinate to a commander named Aldous. But Aldous died under unclear circumstances shortly after the destruction of Thornhold. A riding accident, they said. His horse fell on him. No witnesses. The implications were staggering. Convenient death. Missing accountability. A pattern that suggested deliberate erasure of evidence. I need to investigate further," Kyle said. "But I cannot do this openly. If Vorian is involved, any overt investigation will alert him. He will destroy records or flee." "Why are you telling me this?" Evra asked. "I attempted to murder you. I am the enemy." Kyle looked at her then, and for a moment, his expression was unguarded. She saw the weight he carried, the burden of rule, the isolation of a man who could trust no one, because leaving you in the dark would make me the tyrant you were taught to see. Kyle replied, "You deserve the truth, without omissions." Cess to the castle's resources, with Cale's guidance, she began to see the gaps in the narrative that Rowain had constructed for her. The timeline was inconsistent. The facts didn't align. The person she had believed responsible for her trauma had been a child when the trauma occurred. But if Cale hadn't destroyed Thornhold, then who had? Vorian began to make sense as that answer, though Cale moved cautiously. On one afternoon, as Evra was being guided through the castle gardens by her ever-present guards, the Beta appeared. He studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between satisfaction and calculation. "Interesting," Vorian murmured, his eyes moving across her face. "The Alpha King has taken an interest in his would-be assassin. That is unexpected. The Alpha King values truth," Evra replied carefully, "over vengeance." "Does he?" Vorian's smile was thin. "How idealistic. The world rarely rewards such virtue." He leaned closer. "You should consider carefully what you believe you know about the past. Narratives are malleable things, easily shaped by those who tell them. And truth is often less important than utility." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her unsettled. That evening, Cale requested her presence in his private chamber. It was a risk for both of them. A king and a captive alone together violated every protocol, every boundary of propriety. She went anyway, driven by something she couldn't name. The room was simple. A bed, a desk scattered with papers, a fireplace where flames danced in the hearth. Kyle stood before the fire, his silhouette framed by orange light. "I need to accelerate my investigation," he said without preamble. "Vorian is becoming nervous. I can see it in his movements, his responses. Someone has informed him that questions are being asked." "What do you need from me?" Evra asked. "I need you to train," Cale said. "I need you to learn to shift. The transformation is locked within you, held back by trauma and fear. But if you could access your wolf form, if you could fully integrate with your shifter nature, you would be stronger. You would understand yourself more completely." "I have tried," Evra said quietly. "For 15 years I have tried. My body refuses." "Your body doesn't refuse," Cale corrected. "Your mind does. And I believe that refusal is connected to the trauma of Thornhold, to whatever you witnessed when you were 4 years old. We need to help you process that trauma, to move through it rather than around it." He turned to face her fully then. "I cannot promise this will be easy. In fact, I am certain it will be difficult, but I believe it is necessary, both for your healing and for my investigation. Will you allow me to help?" She should have refused. All rational thought screamed at her to maintain distance, to protect herself from further vulnerability. But looking at this man who had every reason to want her dead, who instead offered understanding and assistance, she found herself nodding. "Then we begin tomorrow," Kyle said. "And we will not stop until you are whole." Chapter 5. The Awakening Within. The castle gardens transformed Evra in ways she had not anticipated. Mornings began with training. Not the brutal conditioning she had endured under Rowain's tutelage, but something more nuanced. Kale worked with her directly, teaching her the combat styles that the kingdom's warriors employed. Their differences were instructive. Where rogue techniques relied on desperation and raw fury, kingdom swordplay emphasized precision and calculated restraint. What surprised her most was acceptance. The soldiers who trained alongside her had not received orders to welcome her. Yet they did. A woman who had attempted to poison their king should have been met with hostility, suspicion, contempt. Instead, they offered correction when her stance wavered, demonstrated techniques with patient repetition, competed with her without attempting to humiliate or destroy. They treated her as a member of their order rather than an outsider. Within 3 weeks, the castle staff began to acknowledge her presence without visible resentment. Within 5, servants greeted her by name. The castle healer, an elderly woman named Marta, who carried the faint scent of herbs and magic, began visiting her chamber with remedies for the muscle soreness that came from intensive training. "You're learning quickly," Marta observed one evening, examining Evra's shoulders, where bruises were already beginning to fade at an accelerated pace. Evidence of her shifter heritage working to heal her human form. "Your body remembers what your mind has forgotten." "What do you mean?" Evra asked. "You are shifter," Marta said simply. "Even if you haven't transformed, your biology is shifter. Your cells know how to repair themselves, how to strengthen, how to adapt. You were trained to ignore that knowledge, but it's still there, waiting." The conversation stayed with her through subsequent days. The idea that her body possessed capabilities independent of her conscious will was both comforting and unsettling. Nobles began appearing at the castle in increasing numbers as autumn progressed. Betas from surrounding territories arrived for scheduled consultations with Kale regarding trade agreements and territorial matters. Each brought their own entourage, their own political agendas, their own assessments of the situation. Evra observed how they reacted to her presence. Some ignored her completely, a calculated dismissal that stung more than overt hostility. Others regarded her with undisguised suspicion. A few showed interest that bordered on predatory, as though they were attempting to determine whether she represented opportunity or threat. It was Lord Brennan from the Northwestern Territories who first verbalized what others had been thinking. "Remarkable," he murmured during a formal dinner, his eyes tracking her movements across the hall. "An infiltrator who has become counsel to the Alpha King. Tell me, Lady Evra, do you maintain communication with your rogue handlers? Does Rowain know where you are?" The question silenced nearby conversations. All eyes turned toward her. "I maintain no communication with anyone from my past," Evra replied, her voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. "I have bound myself to the Alpha King through oath. That oath prevents contact with those who harbored hostile intent." "A convenient oath," Brennan observed. "One that conveniently prevents verification of your loyalty." "Her loyalty has been proven through action," another voice interjected. It was Lady Seraph, who commanded the Eastern Coastal Territories. She was young for a beta, perhaps 5 years older than Evra, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I have observed this woman training our warriors. She teaches technique without ego. She accepts correction. She demonstrates commitment to skill development rather than dominance. These are the qualities of someone genuinely invested in this kingdom's strength." Brennan smiled without warmth. "Or the qualities of someone extremely skilled at deception." The tension that resulted from that exchange rippled through the castle's political ecosystem. Kale addressed it directly in his chamber later that evening when Evra was summoned. "Some of the betas are questioning your presence," he said without preamble. "Vorian is feeding their doubts. He suggests that keeping you here is a security risk, that your presence destabilizes relationships with other territories. Then perhaps I should leave," Evra said quietly. "I did not come here to damage your authority or strain your alliances." "You will not leave," Kyle replied, and there was something possessive in his tone that made her breath catch. But we need to accelerate certain investigations. Vorian is becoming aggressive in his manipulation of other betas. That suggests he is nervous about something. Over the following days, Kyle began spending additional time in the castle archives. Evra joined him when her training schedule permitted. Together, they examined records of the old king's final months, scrutinizing medical documentation and household accounts for anomalies. What emerged was a pattern of suspicious absence. The royal physician had been absent during the period surrounding the old king's death. Court records showed no formal cause of death investigation. The body had been cremated within a single day, unusual for royal protocol that typically mandated a mourning period before final rites. Everything was expedited, Kale murmured, studying a ledger entry from 15 years prior. Someone moved quickly to ensure that questions would not be asked. Vorian? Evra asked. Almost certainly, but I need proof. Something beyond circumstantial evidence. Something that would convince the other betas in the council. He closed the ledger with deliberate care. For now, we maintain appearances. We give him no indication that suspicion exists. The tension of maintaining that deception began to manifest physically. Evra found herself more frequently prey to stress responses, her muscles tightening, her breathing becoming shallow, her mind spiraling into worst-case scenarios. The control she had cultivated over 15 years of training began to fracture under the weight of simultaneous investigations and political instability. It happened during combat training one afternoon when the pressure finally crested. She was sparring with one of the senior warriors, a man named Thorn, who was testing the improvements in her technique. A strike came, perfectly executed, nothing unusual about it. But her body reacted with disproportionate intensity. Her hand began to change. At first, it was subtle. Her fingers elongated slightly, the nails hardening and beginning to curve into something resembling claws. Pain shot through her palm as bones attempted to restructure. She gasped, pulling away from Thorn and cradling her hand against her chest. Everyone stopped moving. "It's beginning," Kale said, and there was wonder in his voice. He approached slowly, giving her time to acclimate to the shock of what was happening. "Your body is starting to respond. The trauma is loosening its grip." The transformation reversed almost immediately, her hand returning to fully human form. But the point had been made. Something inside her was waking. Something that had been locked away since childhood was beginning to push against the walls that fear and pain had constructed. "This is progress," Kale said quietly. "Genuine transformation will come when you're ready, when the psychological barriers fall away completely." Over the subsequent week, small transformations became more frequent. A finger here, a patch of wolf fur there, partial shifts that were uncomfortable and disorienting, but undeniable evidence of integration beginning. Each instance left her exhausted, but also exhilarated. Part of her was returning to wholeness. The political situation, however, continued to deteriorate. Vorian appeared increasingly agitated, his movements suggesting decision-making occurring behind closed doors. He was consolidating support among certain betas, those who felt threatened by Kale's progressive reforms, those who harbored their own ambitions for expanded power. One evening, as Evra walked the castle corridors returning to her chamber after late training, she overheard Vorian speaking with Lord Brennan in an alcove off the main hall. "The Alpha King loses credibility by keeping her here," Vorian was saying, "and his obsession with ancient history, with investigating his father's death, it demonstrates instability. A strong ruler focuses on present concerns, not past grievances." "What are you proposing?" Brennan asked. "That the council should consider whether the current leadership is truly adequate for the demands of our territories. There are those who believe a more decisive hand would serve the kingdom better." Evra moved away before she could hear more, her heart racing. This was more than political maneuvering. This was the beginning of something more dangerous, the foundation for actual challenges to Kale's authority. She reported what she had heard immediately. Kale listened without interrupting, then rose from where he had been seated. "We are running out of time," he said grimly. "Vorian is positioning himself to move against me. I need to find irrefutable proof of his involvement in my father's death before he decides that eliminating me would be more expedient than attempting to undermine me politically." The weight of that realization settled between them. They were approaching a crisis point, and everything they had begun to build, the fragile connection that had formed between them, the possibility of Evra's healing and integration into a new life, hung in the balance. Chapter 6. Truth and Revelation. The letter lay before them on the polished wooden surface of Cale's private desk, its edges worn from age, the parchment yellowed to the color of old bone. The handwriting was meticulous, deliberate, the script of someone accustomed to recording decisions of magnitude. Evra read the words twice, unable to fully process their meaning even as her eyes traced each carefully constructed sentence. "They destroyed Thornhold as a test," she whispered. "A test of loyalty." Cale stood near the window, his silhouette framed against the pale morning light filtering through the glass. He had been standing there for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the same document, as though repetition might somehow alter the reality it described. "Not just your village," he said quietly. He was establishing a pattern, demonstrating to the pack leaders that he could execute difficult decisions without hesitation, that he possessed the resolve necessary to lead, if circumstances required it. The implications of that statement hung between them like a blade suspended above water. Rowan had not been wrong about the intentionality behind Thornhold's destruction. He had simply been wrong about who had ordered it. They had found the letter in Vorian's private chambers, hidden behind a false panel in his desk. Cale had finally moved openly, authorizing a full search of his beta's residences based on suspicions that had accumulated over weeks of careful investigation. What they discovered was damning. Not just the authorization for Thornhold's destruction, but correspondence regarding the old king's final illness, medical records that had been altered, orders for specific poisons obtained from sources that should not have been accessible to anyone but royal apothecaries. Vorian had been thorough. He had been meticulous. He had also been convinced of his own righteousness. When they brought him to the interrogation chamber, he did not attempt to deny anything. Instead, he had simply sat in the chair designated for the accused and waited. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, as though a weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "You poisoned my father," Cale had said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what those words represented. "I saved the kingdom," Vorian replied. "Your father was losing his grip on power. His decisions had become erratic. He was weakening. I did what needed to be done. You murdered the king. I replaced weakness with strength. With you." Vorian's eyes met Cale's directly. "You were young, but you had the capacity to rule effectively. The kingdom needed what you could become. Your father was an obstacle to that future." The calm certainty of his conviction was perhaps more disturbing than overt denial would have been. Vorian truly believed that murdering his king had been not just justified, but necessary. Morally correct, even. The interrogation had continued for hours. Details emerged. The manner of poisoning. The careful selection of symptoms that would mimic natural illness. The manipulation of medical records to prevent investigation. And then, when Vorian realized that his rationalizations were failing to convince, he had simply begun listing other acts. Other decisions made in service to what he considered the greater good. Thornhold had been one among many. Cale had him imprisoned in the deepest cells of the castle, where stone walls 3 feet thick insulated the chambers from external sound. He ordered that no one was to speak with Vorian, that no one was to even acknowledge his existence. It was a form of psychological torment, more effective than any physical punishment could have been. Complete isolation, absolute erasure from the world of the living while still drawing breath. But not before the news had begun to spread. Someone, Cale suspected one of the guards who harbored sympathy for Vorian's philosophy, had leaked the information. Within 2 days, rumors had circulated through the kingdom's political hierarchy. The Alpha King was investigating his beta. The beta was imprisoned. The reason for imprisonment was allegedly treason, though the specific nature remained unclear. The betas from surrounding territories began arriving at the castle in a state of agitation. Lord Brennan led the contingent that demanded formal explanation. He brought with him 4 other territorial leaders, all of whom possessed significant military forces and long-standing concerns about Cale's authority. "This is unprecedented," Brennan declared, his voice echoing through the throne room where Kyle sat elevated on his seat of power. The imprisonment of a beta, without public trial, without offering the accused opportunity to defend himself before the council. It suggests either instability in your judgment or something far more sinister. Vorian has been given every opportunity to explain his actions, Kyle replied calmly. He has chosen instead to rationalize them as necessary. The evidence of his crimes is substantial. Crimes, another beta interjected, a woman named Sylvain who controlled the southern grain territories. You accuse your most trusted advisor of crimes, yet we are given no concrete evidence. We are expected to accept your judgment based solely on your word. The evidence will be presented when the formal trial occurs, Kale said, which will be held before the full council, with representatives from every significant territory present. Nothing is being hidden. And what of the woman you harbor? Brennan asked, his eyes moving to where Evra stood at the periphery of the throne room. The rogue who attempted your murder. Why is she not imprisoned? Why does she move freely through your castle? Is this not evidence of poor judgment? The question was designed to wound, and it succeeded. Evra felt every eye in the room turn toward her, assessing, questioning, suspicious. Evra is here under oath, Kale said, his tone dangerous now, the golden light beginning to appear in his eyes. She has submitted to binding that prevents her from escape or violence. More importantly, she has been invaluable in uncovering the conspiracy that resulted in my father's death. Convenient, Sylvain murmured, that an assassin would suddenly become an ally in investigating matters of state. Before Kale could respond, Evra stepped forward. Every rational thought told her to remain silent, to avoid drawing additional attention. But she could see the doubt in the room, could see the way that carefully constructed questions were beginning to erode Kale's authority. I was sent here to kill the Alpha King because I was given false information about his role in the destruction of my village, she said, her voice carrying through the chamber. The man imprisoned for conspiracy was responsible for that destruction. The Alpha King has helped me understand the truth. I have no allegiance to rogue packs or their interests. My loyalty now lies with this kingdom and its ruler. Words, Brennan said dismissively. Words spoken under what duress, under what coercion. But Evra could see that some of the other betas were reconsidering. Lady Seraph stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. I have observed this woman training our warriors, she said. She demonstrates commitment to this kingdom's strength. And more importantly, the Alpha King's transparency regarding his investigation demonstrates a ruler concerned with justice rather than power consolidation. A tyrant would execute his beta without explanation. A true leader demands accountability and evidence. The support shifted the balance. Not completely. Brennan and his faction remained unconvinced, but enough of the other territorial leaders were willing to wait for the formal trial that the immediate crisis of authority was averted. Kale dismissed the council, and as the betas filed from the throne room, Evra followed him to his private chambers. He moved with barely controlled fury, the tension radiating from his body suggesting that his wolf form was straining against the boundaries of his human skin. This is far from over, he said grimly. Vorian's supporters are numerous. They will attempt to manipulate the trial, to create doubt, to suggest that I have orchestrated these accusations to consolidate power. Can they succeed? Evra asked. Possibly. If the evidence I present is not irrefutable, if I show any sign of weakness or doubt, the betas will move against me. Civil war would result. The kingdom would fragment. The weight of that possibility settled between them. Before Evra could respond, a guard appeared at the chamber door, his expression urgent. Your Majesty, the guard said, breathless. The beta has attempted suicide in his cell. He is still alive, but barely. The healers are with him now. Kale and Evra exchanged a look. Vorian's attempted self-termination was perhaps the most damning evidence yet. An admission of guilt that no words could match. A man truly convinced of his righteousness would not attempt to end his own life. But the respite from crisis was brief. The attack came at midnight. Rogues poured through the castle gates with coordinated precision, their numbers suggesting substantial planning and resource commitment. The guards at the gate died quickly, overwhelmed by superior numbers and the ferocity of shifters in their wolf forms. Within minutes, fighting had spread through the castle's lower levels, and Kale was summoning his warriors to defense positions. Evra had never imagined that Rowain would risk an actual assault on the castle. The strategic calculation seemed sound in its desperation. If Vorian was dead or imprisoned, if the conspiracy was revealed, then the rogue pack's position was fundamentally compromised. Recovering Evra, or taking vengeance against the man who had captured her, would serve no purpose except to reclaim some measure of dignity in the face of comprehensive failure. Yet here he was, throwing everything at the walls of the castle as though sheer determination could overcome the overwhelming defensive advantages. The battle was chaos and violence, and terror compressed into corridors never meant to contain such carnage. Evra found herself fighting alongside castle warriors, using techniques she had learned over the past weeks of training. Her movements were precise, economical, lethal, but she was still human, still limited by the constraints of a single body moving through three-dimensional space at speeds her mind could barely process. And then the limitation fell away. The pain was indescribable. Every cell in her body seemed to be reshaping itself simultaneously, bones elongating and restructuring, muscles reorganizing, fur erupting from her skin like a violent flowering. She screamed, but the sound that emerged was something between human and animal, a noise that belonged to neither realm fully. When the transformation completed, she stood on 4 legs instead of 2. Her perspective had shifted, become lower and wider. The world had transformed into something more complex, full of scents and textures that her human senses had never perceived. Her wolf form was white as moonlight, her eyes the same piercing blue-gray they had always been. She was smaller than she should have been, more delicate than other shifters, but when she moved, the power in every motion was undeniable. The rogues fighting inside the castle walls suddenly found themselves confronted with a predator they had not anticipated. And when Kyle transformed into his own massive dark wolf form, moving with the fluidity of centuries of mastery over his shifter nature, the battle's trajectory became clear. Rowain had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The rogues began to retreat, but their escape routes had been cut off by castle warriors who had anticipated such an attempt. Within an hour, those who had not fled into the night were captured or dead. Rowain himself was cornered in the great hall, his wolf form bleeding from multiple wounds, his options exhausted. He transformed back to human form rather than accept capture in his vulnerable state. And for a moment, he simply stared at Evra, still wolf, still bearing the physical evidence of her transformation. The shock in his expression was profound. "You became what I couldn't force you to become," he said, understanding flooding through him. Evra shifted back to human form, and for the first time in her conscious memory, she did so with control rather than desperate struggling. Her body reformed, muscle and bone and skin reorganizing into a configuration she recognized as herself. But different now, whole. "I became what I always was," she replied, her voice steady. "You simply refused to acknowledge it." The castle guards took Rowain into custody, securing him in cells adjacent to where Vorian was imprisoned. Both conspirators, both manipulators of her life, both rendered powerless by the revealing of truth. Chapter 7. Bonds Forged in Fire. The aftermath of battle transformed the castle into something resembling a military encampment. Healers moved between the wounded, their hands glowing with subtle magic as they mended injuries that would have taken weeks to recover from naturally. The death toll had been significant. 16 castle guards and 7 rogues who had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The cost of Rowain's desperation written in blood across stone floors. Evra found herself existing in a strange space between exhaustion and exhilaration. Her body still thrummed with the aftermath of transformation, her nerves singing with awareness of her newfound nature. She could feel her wolf beneath her skin now, present rather than distant, accessible rather than locked away behind walls of trauma. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Kyle summoned her to his chamber once the immediate chaos had been contained. He looked diminished somehow, despite the obvious strength radiating from him. The burden of what had transpired, the betrayal of his beta, the revelation of his father's murder, the assault on his authority, had etched itself into the lines of his face. "Rowain will stand trial alongside Vorian," he said without preamble. "They will be charged with crimes against the kingdom. The evidence against both is substantial." "What sentence will you impose?" Evra asked. "That is not my decision alone. Kyle replied. "The council will determine appropriate punishment. But Evra, I need you to understand something. Rowain raised you. He was the only family you knew for 15 years. When sentences passed, it may require you to confront emotions you have not yet processed." She nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words, even as she felt the strange absence of the deep rage that had defined her relationship with Rowain. What she had felt toward him had transformed into something more complicated. Disappointment, resentment, but also a growing recognition that he had believed himself righteous in his manipulations. The formal trials were scheduled to begin 3 days after the attack. The council chamber was packed with representatives from every significant territory. Betas who had traveled to witness justice being administered, or, depending on their sympathies, to ensure that Kale did not abuse his authority in ways that might threaten their own power bases. Vorian was brought forward first, his appearance shocking to those who had known him as a man of careful grooming and controlled presentation. Imprisonment and the failed suicide attempt had left him diminished. Bandages wrapped his wrists where he had attempted to sever his own veins. His eyes held a vacancy that suggested his mind had already retreated from the world. The charges were read aloud by the kingdom's chief magistrate: poisoning of the previous Alpha King, unauthorized destruction of the village of Thornhold, conspiracy against the crown, manipulation of military forces for personal gain, attempted suicide while in custody, a technical charge that carried implications of cowardice and instability. Vorian did not attempt to defend himself. He simply sat in the chair designated for the accused and waited. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he remained silent. "I did what was necessary," he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "History will judge me more favorably than you do." The council deliberated for a single hour. The verdict was unanimous. Imprisonment in perpetuity, confined to the deepest cells of the castle, where he would spend the remainder of his existence in complete isolation. No visitors, no communication. Essentially, he would be erased from the world of the living while still drawing breath. It was a mercy in its way. Execution would have been kinder, and a punishment that reflected the kingdom's belief that some crimes were too profound to allow the perpetrator the dignity of a quick death. Rowain's trial was more contentious. He stood before the council with the bearing of a man who had never fully accepted defeat. His scarred features held no remorse, only calculation. He had been intelligent enough to recognize that his attack on the castle had failed catastrophically, but he seemed to be assessing how to minimize the damage through strategic cooperation. "I acted in defense of my pack," he stated when given opportunity to speak. "The woman you now honor was stolen from us. I sought her return." "You sought to murder the Alpha King," the magistrate corrected. "You led an assault on the castle that resulted in deaths of castle guards and rogues alike. This was not a rescue operation. This was an act of war." "The rogue packs are sovereign entities," Rowain replied. "We maintain our own laws, our own territories. What you call war, we call defense of our interests." "You harbored false information that led a woman to attempt murder," another council member interjected. Lord Brennan, surprisingly, seemed intent on ensuring that Rowain faced full accountability for his crimes. "You manipulated her emotions and her sense of identity. You constructed an entire narrative designed to weaponize her against the Alpha King. How is this not conspiracy to commit regicide?" Rowain's expression hardened. She was a tool, nothing more. The statement hung in the chamber, and Evra felt something crystallize inside her chest. The man who had raised her, who had given her identity and purpose, truly viewed her only as an instrument, not with cruelty. That would have been simpler, but with the cold assessment of someone evaluating a piece of equipment. The council's verdict was exile. Rowain would be banished from all territories under Kale's dominion. He could not return. He could not attempt communication with any members of the castle or the kingdom proper. Other rogues captured during the assault were given a choice: submission to kingdom authority, with integration into legitimate society, or exile with Rowain. 4 rogues chose exile. The remainder, perhaps recognizing that their previous leader's venture had failed completely, accepted integration. They would be absorbed into the kingdom's military structure, their shifter abilities repurposed toward legitimate defense rather than rogue operations. As Rowain was escorted from the chamber, his eyes met Evra's. For a moment, she saw something flicker across his features. regret perhaps, or the dawning realization that his manipulations had failed to control her as intended. Then the moment passed, and he was gone. That evening, Cale requested Evra's presence in the throne room after the daily business of governance had concluded. She arrived to find it empty except for him, his guards dismissed to distant positions. "Come here," he said, his voice gentle despite the formal setting. She approached, uncertain of what was about to transpire. Cale rose from his throne and descended the steps, meeting her in the open space before the raised platform where he typically held court. "In front of the council, I acknowledged you as someone essential to the kingdom," he said, "but there is something I need to acknowledge in front of witnesses of a different kind." He dropped to one knee, and Evra's breath caught in her throat. "You came to kill me," he continued. "You were lied to, manipulated, weaponized against me. And yet, when given the opportunity to understand the truth, you chose to accept it. You chose to confront the beliefs that had shaped your entire existence. You chose to heal. You chose me." He reached for her hand, his fingers gentle as they enclosed hers. Among shifters, mate bonds are sacred things. They are recognition of another soul as equal to one's own. They are commitments that transcend time and circumstance. His eyes met hers, and she saw in them the reflection of flames from the torches lining the chamber. "I am asking you to accept my claim, not as prisoner, not as ally, but as mate, as my partner in whatever comes next." Evra opened her mouth to respond, but words seemed inadequate to the magnitude of what was transpiring. She had come to this castle seeking vengeance. She had found instead healing, connection, purpose beyond the narrow framework of hatred that had imprisoned her. "Yes," she whispered, and the words seemed to reverberate through the chamber with power that transcended its simplicity. Kyle rose and pulled her against him, and she felt the moment something fundamental shifted between them. It was not purely physical, though certainly there was attraction that manifested as electric awareness whenever they occupied the same space. It was something deeper, a recognition at the level of DNA, of shifter nature acknowledging shifter nature as compatible at the most fundamental level. When he kissed her, she tasted salt and smoke and something wild that belonged uniquely to him. His hands moved across her back, possessive and tender simultaneously. The mate bond was consolidating itself, weaving connections that would persist regardless of distance or circumstance. They would face challenges ahead. The kingdom's political structures would need time to stabilize after the revelation of Vorian's betrayals. Other territories would test Cale's authority, seeking to exploit any perceived weakness. Nobles would question whether a woman of rogue origins could serve as mate to the Alpha King without introducing instability. But in that moment, in the empty throne room with only the flames bearing witness, none of that mattered. There was only Cale and Evra, the woman who had come seeking death, and found instead a life worth living. Chapter 8. The Weight of Tomorrow. 8 months had passed since the battles that reshaped the kingdom's political landscape. The seasons had turned, winter retreating before spring's inevitable advance, and with it came a different kind of transformation than the violent upheaval that had preceded it. Evra stood in the courtyard designated for diplomatic meetings, watching as representatives from the rogue territories that had accepted integration presented proposals for resource allocation and territorial governance. Her role had evolved organically from prisoner to advisor to something approaching ambassador, a bridge between the kingdom's established structures and the communities that had previously existed in deliberate opposition to them. "The northern encampments require additional provisions before the planting season," a man named Corin said. He had been among the rogues captured during the assault on the castle, and he had proven himself invaluable in negotiations with other shifter communities. His weathered face bore the marks of a harsh life, but his eyes held intelligence and genuine interest in building something sustainable rather than merely surviving day to day. "I will speak with the kingdom's quartermaster," Evra replied, making notes on parchment before her. "But Corin, you understand that resources are limited. The kingdom has its own obligations to territories that have maintained allegiance for generations. We cannot offer preferential treatment without creating resentment among established populations." "We understand," Corin said, and there was gratitude in his voice. "A year ago, Evra would never have imagined rogues demonstrating such acceptance of limitations. But Rowain's failed assault had fundamentally altered the calculation for those who had survived it. Continued resistance was futile. Cooperation offered possibility of genuine integration rather than perpetual exile. As the meeting concluded and the delegations dispersed, Evra found herself wandering toward the castle gardens. The space had become her refuge, a location where the weight of her responsibilities could be temporarily set aside. The elaborate flower arrangements planted in autumn had begun their spring emergence, buds swelling with potential. Lady Seraph was already there, seated on a bench overlooking the most elaborate section of the gardens. The beta from the Eastern Territories had become something approaching a friend, a woman of her own age, who shared the particular burdens that came with occupying spaces not traditionally designated for shifter women in positions of authority. "The meetings are progressing well," Seraph observed as Evra settled beside her. "You have a gift for finding compromise that satisfies multiple interests without requiring anyone to feel as though they have surrendered essential principles." "I learned it by necessity," Evra replied. "When you have been lied to systematically, when your entire foundation of understanding has been revealed as constructed deception, you develop appreciation for truth, even uncomfortable truth, and people sense that authenticity. Some people," Seraph corrected gently. "There are still those among the council who view you as temporary novelty. They wait for the moment when your usefulness expires, anticipating that Kale will move past his current attachment." Evra smiled despite the sting of the observation. "Let them wait. I have discovered that time tends to validate choices made with genuine intention. Those who harbored doubts about my commitment to this kingdom have watched me work tirelessly in service to its stability. Either they will revise their assessments, or they will continue in their resistance. Either way, my actions remain unchanged." That evening, Kale summoned her to his private chamber. These had become regular occurrences, meetings ostensibly focused on governance matters, but increasingly dominated by something more personal. The mate bond had only strengthened over the months that had passed since its initial declaration. When they occupied the same space, there was a particular quality to the air between them, a charge that required conscious effort to maintain professional distance when servants or advisors were present. Tonight, however, they were alone. "Come here," Kale said, and she moved to him without hesitation. He pulled her against his body, his fingers threading through her hair. Her wolf form had fully integrated into her consciousness by now, no longer a source of shock or confusion, but simply another aspect of her nature as natural and accessible as her human form. "I have been considering something," he said quietly. "Something that would normally terrify you, I suspect, given your history." She tilted her head, studying his expression in the firelight. "Tell me." "Children," he said simply. "The kingdom needs heirs. And more than that, I want to create a future with you that extends beyond the immediate crises we have navigated." She felt the rush of conflicting emotions. Joy at the prospect of building something permanent with him. Terror rooted in her oldest trauma. The loss of her mother. The understanding of how fragile life could be. How quickly love could be wrenched away. "I am afraid," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I know," Kale replied. "I am afraid as well. But Evra, I have learned that love is not absence of fear. It is choosing to proceed despite fear. Choosing to build despite knowing that loss is always possible. My father died when I was young. I grieved. I survived. And having survived that loss, I would not choose to never have known him." She pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. The mate bond hummed between them, a resonance at the cellular level that transcended simple physical attraction. "I need time," she said, "not to decide, but to process, to understand that I can be a mother without repeating the losses that shaped my childhood." "Take whatever time you require," Kale said. "We have nothing but time now." The next morning brought clear skies, and the kind of warmth that suggested spring was genuinely establishing itself across the kingdom. Evra found herself wandering toward the northern reaches of the castle grounds, toward the forest that began just beyond the cultivated lands. In her wanderings, she eventually came to a decision that she had been postponing for months. It was time to visit Rowain. The cell block designated for long-term prisoners was a grim place, constructed to contain dangerous individuals indefinitely. Rowan occupied one of the larger chambers, though the space was still confining by any reasonable standard. When Evra entered, he looked up from where he had been seated on his bunk. His appearance had deteriorated over the intervening months. His hair had grayed further, his face become gaunt, his eyes hollowed by the particular weight of isolation. She regarded him without the complex tangle of emotion she had expected to experience. "Hello, Rowan," she said simply. "You have come to gloat," he said, his tone flat. "To demonstrate your triumph." "I have come to say goodbye," Evra replied. "You are no longer significant enough to me to inspire either gloating or anger. You raised me. You gave me identity when I had none. But you did so for your own purposes, with manipulation built into every interaction. That ends now." He stared at her, and she saw the moment understanding crystallized in his expression. She meant what she said. He had been released from the significance of her hatred. He was simply a man who had failed, imprisoned in a cell that would contain him for the remainder of his life. "I forgive you," she said, and meant it with the peculiar mercy that true indifference offered. "But not because you deserve forgiveness, but because holding on to the anger only continues to damage me. I release it." "I release you." She turned to leave, but he spoke before she could exit the chamber. "You were better with me," he said desperately. "You were stronger when you hated. This softness, this integration into their world, it will make you weak." "Perhaps," Evra said, pausing at the threshold. "But I would rather be weak and whole than strong and broken. Goodbye, Rowan." She walked away without looking back. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Evra stripped away her human form and allowed her wolf to emerge. The transformation had become so natural now that she barely registered the sensation of restructuring, the immediate expansion of perception that came with wolf senses replacing human ones. Kale joined her in the forest adjacent to the castle, his own transformation complete. His dark form was massive compared to her pale one, but they moved with identical grace as they navigated the trees and undergrowth. Without conscious direction, they found themselves moving toward the location where she had been rescued all those years ago. The forest had transformed, just as she had. Trees had grown larger. The landscape had shifted subtly with time's passage, but the general geography remained recognizable. They ran together through that ancient forest, two wolves moving as one through the darkness. Evra felt the profound peace that came from wholeness, from integration of all her scattered pieces into a coherent whole. She had been raised by rogues to hate. She had been broken by truth. She had healed through connection. This was the space she had come from. Fear and trauma and loss. But it was also the space she was choosing to return to. Transformed. No longer victim. No longer weapon. No longer prisoner of someone else's narrative. She was simply Evra. Whole. Capable. Loved. And possessed of futures still to be constructed. Still to be chosen. Still to be lived. As they ran through the night, the forest embracing them, she understood that this was the truest version of home she had ever known. Not the cottage in Thornhold, destroyed before she could fully form memories of it. Not the rogue camp where she had been raised. But this space between past and future. This moment where trauma had been acknowledged and transformed into wisdom. Where enemies had become partners. This was home. The end.